Good evening, Dungeon Masters. I'm Baron Durop. World building is a daunting task. It can be difficult to know how much world building is too much or too little, and to know what information you need to meaningfully support a D&D campaign story. Fortunately, with the 3 Rs of pop geopolitical analysis, that is, roots, resources, and relationships, we can quickly scaffold the machinations of our game world and understand how factions would respond to player shenanigans. While geopolitics customarily discusses how geography influences state-acting entities, it can also be used for much smaller organizations or geographical regions. French school geopolitician Yves Lacoste is famous for turning our modern understanding of geopolitics on its head. His work on the various war crimes committed by belligerents in the Vietnam War, published in his book Geography is Primarily Used for Waging War, showed us how both state and non-state actors like the Viet Cong, various French NGOs, and the United States military were all affected by the constraints of the Vietnamese geography, and how those war crimes they committed were directly tied to altering that geography. Therefore, as we work through Austin School geopolitician Roger Baker's 3 Rs of Geopolitical Analysis, it's important to understand that an organized group of people doesn't necessarily mean a kingdom or a nation-state. A trade organization like Faerun's Lord Alliance or some brotherhood of pirates scattered across an archipelago are all geopolitical influencers which can be analyzed using this framework. In essence, just because the central headquarters of a wealthy merchant guild is located in a capital city doesn't mean that that city government will have the same assumptions, fears, and needs as the guild itself. The first of these 3 Rs, roots, describes the various avenues or methods each people group uses to interact with each other. Obvious examples of these routes might be a literal road connecting 2 cities, but that just scratches the surface. Rivers, trade winds, hiking trails, tunnels, aqueducts, Vespin gas pipelines, teleportation circle networks, or even interdimensional portals are all physical representations of these routes. In this physical form, most routes allow for the carrying of personnel and material from one location to another. Alternatively, some of these routes, especially in our modern world, including electrification infrastructure, undersea fiber optic cables, or even 5G cellular towers, are all specifically designed for moving information or energy instead of the more typical stuff like people or commodities. Furthermore, certain routes have various costs and limitations associated with them which influence how populations might use them. For example, floating bulk goods on a river barge or shipping them via sailing vessels costs only a fraction of moving the same goods by a horse-drawn wagon. The trade-off, though, is that sailing ships and barges are limited where the wind and water is, and may have alternative costs like travel time. Likewise, teleportation circles can bring a small amount of people or items rapidly across large distances, but require an expensive wizard's expertise and lots of preparation time to build and enchant the circles. Also important to consider is where routes don't exist as well. Geography sometimes dictates that material traversal is too costly to be worthwhile, and so no route will be constructed and maintained there. Vast stretches of windless ocean, immense windswept deserts, or jagged and impervious mountains can make the terrain difficult or impossible to cross. Just as routes facilitate communication and resource allocation across societies, a lack of these routes, specifically those deserts, oceans, and mountains, also provide organized populations with physical strategic depth. It's much more difficult for a belligerent nation to attack you if there's a massive desert or mountain chain creating buffer space. This is exactly why the Egyptian Empire remained the regional hegemon until, among other things, improved horse riding technology allowed the Achaemenid Empire to cross the Mediterranean with an army for invasion. Therefore, as you analyze an organized people's routes, take note of where they are, where they aren't, and how the presence, absence, or blend of various kinds of routes influence how these people transport resources and ideas. So how do you keep your players interested in traveling on all of these routes? This video's sponsor, Describe, is a perfect resource for inspiration. Describe's Place Collection is a great tool for fleshing out your random encounter travel tables with interesting roadway encounters, or for populating your game world with cairns, ruins, and roadhouses. I love how some of their best descriptions are elegantly simple. Not all encounters need to be elaborate to be worthwhile. This description for a path leading into an obscured cave hidden hidden by shrubs invites players to explore the area almost like they found a secret location in a video game. So get inspired by checking out Describe's link in the description below and use the coupon code Baron when you sign up to get 10% off. Thanks to Describe for sponsoring this video. Resources might seem obvious at first glance, but come deeply into focus within the context of the routes they exist on. If the board game Settlers of Catan has taught us anything, every group of Fantasyland people needs ore, grain, brick, lumber, and wool to be successful, and each of those commodities are derived from exposed rock faces, irrigated fields, windswept riverbanks, old-growth forests, and open pasture, respectively. The scale at which these resources are extracted from the land and pushed through the value-added supply chain is directly related to the strength of the roots on which each commodity sits. Clay may be turned into bricks, but must be fired with brush left over from autumn's harvest. Ore can be turned into steel, but not without charcoal made from the lumber mill's refuse. Bricks and steel make for impenetrable fortresses, but only if you can bring them to the construction site efficiently. What's interesting about the push and pull between the roots and resources is that as each commodity is refined by human expertise and is thusly turned into a more valuable object, the cost of that object reflects the effort of all the labor and material used in each step along the way, while its general utility reduces proportionally. In other words, the more specialized a commodity's process becomes, the more valuable it becomes, but fewer, usually more significant people can use it. A bard's college might have a number of gifted instrument makers who build exquisite harps, but need a steady stream of the highest quality lumber from a nearby lumber mill, which processes the most decadent hardwoods from a nearby forest. That same lumber could have been used to build a house or make hand tools, but the extremely expensive harp is only useful to a musician. So as you explore what resources are available to the people in your fantasy world, think through who makes what with them and from where each group gets their resources. Some commodities might be rather boring and uneventful. Wheat, for example, can be grown almost anywhere, but can only be turned into porridge and bread, so that's not very interesting. However, other resources will form a web of supply chains across the game world. As an example, Chinese silkworms were bred to make silk, which was turned into dyed thread, thread woven into fabric, fabric was fashioned into garments, and those garments were tailored to fit an individual person somewhere halfway around the world in Venice. Once you see how those roots connect the needed resources of various people groups, you have the foundation for analyzing these people's relationships. Relationships don't just describe the way organized peoples interact with each other, but also how they interact with themselves. Understanding these relationships will help you empathize with each people's fears and motivations. A people's religion, culture, and history informs how those people will react to geopolitical events, or rather, how those people will justify their reactions. An organized people's ideology and their assumptions about the world they live in will dictate how they utilize the roots and resources around them. Further, relationships between nearby groups will evolve where commerce and trade are evident. However, when one group becomes fearful that some other people may threaten the flow of an important resource, that group may somehow become belligerent in order to prevent that from happening. How they respond to their fear will largely be dictated by their ideology. Lawsuits, protests, political infiltration, or even declaration of war are all possible options suited to different organizations' belief structures. By understanding a group's ideology, how these ideologies of neighboring groups may cause disagreements, and tracing from where those groups get their needed resources, both material and informational, you can illustrate your world's long-term geopolitical concerns. As you build out this interconnected web of roots, resources, and relationships, ask yourself what happens if single parts of the geopolitical web are removed or compromised. Ask who benefits and who suffers. Which resources, roots, and relationships are most important for each group of people, given the geography they exist in. For example, who wins and loses if a rock slide closes off a mountain pass? Who wins and loses if a religious institution suddenly takes on militant rhetoric? And who wins and loses if a mining operation disturbs a crypt full of undead. In a nutshell, each group will usually have 2 to 3 major geopolitical imperatives they must constantly manage in order to remain a cohesive organization. Understanding what each organization's strategic imperatives are serves as the bedrock for understanding your own game world, and therefore fuel for infinite quest hooking. If you'd like to help me make more content like this in the future, please consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a channel member. Thanks for watching, Dungeon Masters, and until next time, good night.